year, the charity that we're going to be doing our major fundraiser for in the fall is called Parents Supporting Parents. It's about dealing with alcoholism and drug abuse. So that's going to be, the board voted on this last week. That will be our main charity. So the newsletter is going out now monthly. I told you this before, but I'm going to keep repeating it. So every month now we're going to be having a list of what's happening in the newsletter. So the list will include the different activity groups. So if you want to plan ahead for what you're going to be doing or join a group, and the group leaders are no longer having to maintain a list of the people who sign up, because a lot of times many of those people end up never coming. So this way you can look every month in the newsletter and see what's happening and see what you want to do, and the contact person will be there, so then you will email them and let them know you want to attend. So, yeah. Now I have another announcement about the lunches. So you all know what's been going on since COVID, how prices have all risen. And unfortunately I have to tell you that the lunch will be going up next month, starting in March, to $36. So I just want to remind you that it's not only for the food, it's for the entertainment, the sociability, the beautiful setting. So I hope we'll still see you here next month. Now, the other issue is we have a committee now who is going to be looking for new board members. So I would like anyone who's interested to let me know if you're interested in participating and becoming a member of the board. So if you would contact me, I will let the committee know. So they will be starting to contact people and doing some interviewing. Let's see, I think that's it. Susan, do you want to talk about, oh, one other thing. So June, we're going to be doing our fashion show again from Chico's. So we're also looking for,
Even better.
Pork cargo? Last I heard it was Chico's. Yeah.
Our fashion show is on the place. June 21st is our fashion show. And it will be Port Cargo in Mashpee. And so please mark it down, because I think we have to limit the people. So first come, first serve. And also, we want to have people to be a model. So if you want to be a model, come on now. I mean, everybody needs to be a model. And so we need like 20 models. You get a discount of 30%. So we want to open it up to everybody. And if you want to be a model, you need to contact Joanne or Jane. They couldn't come today, so you need to contact them. But don't forget, the rest of you get 20% by attending. So you get a discount too. So make sure you mark it on your calendar.
What was the date again?
June 21st. Oh, you're marking it already? Good.
Okay. All right, and then I just want to remind you, our program next month, I believe, is the trivia one. Correct, Susan?
Yes.
I missed the board meeting last week.
Yes,
I was
I've done
sick.
it before. It's fun.
Okay, good. It's on your table.
The first time we met him, he spoke to our club about Sacco and Vanzetti. Some of you may remember that the father of one of our members was actually on the Sacco and Vanzetti jury. We are so pleased to welcome the Honorable Greg Williams for his third appearance here at Mashpee Women's Club.
See how this, there we go. First of all, I have one little correction to that introduction, and it's not about me. It's about one of your members whose father was the last witness to the events on the Sacco Vanzetti situation. He walked by the two guys who were the shooters in the Sacco and Vanzetti case, and they, in Bridgewater there, and he maintained until the end of his days that he looked into the faces of those two gentlemen, and neither one of them was Sacco or Vanzetti. So he was the last living witness to crime and its immediate privilege. So great to be back here again with you. I wanted to thank Jane, but she told me this was going to be outside today, and that we were going to have a fire pit with marshmallows and stuff like that. So I'm a little disappointed, but that's the way it is. So let me thank too Diane Mahoney, because you're the president. You're the president. You're the president. You're the president. And Susan Creed, who made herself known to me out there in the hallways. I appreciate that. This presentation is, and it only occurred to me last night, rather an unusual one for sort of after luncheon. There are some images in this presentation that are a little on the graphic side. They are not in color, at least, because they're old photographs. But there are some pictures, and what I'm going to do, and I'm not kidding about this, is I'm going to give you fair warning when one of those is about to come up. In case you want to close your eyes or look more intently, whatever's your inclination. So we're going to start in one morning in August of 1892 with this house, which is on 2nd Street in Fall River. And this is not one of the images you need to look away from. It's just a house. There was a 32-year-old woman who lived in this house. Her name was Lizzie Andrew Borden. And she walked, Andrew. Her father's name was Andrew. And her middle name was Andrew. Not Andrews. I know it's weird. But that's not the only weird thing about the case. She walked into the sitting room, and her father was slouched on the sofa. This is one of the possibly disturbing images. Nobody's closing their eyes. I knew you would. This gentleman's condition moved Lizzie to yell upstairs to the maid that someone had killed father. And as that 69-year-old man lay dead in the sitting room with 11 wounds on his head and face, his 64-year-old wife, another sort of graphic, lay dead in the sitting room with 11 wounds on her head and face. She was face down on the rug there in the upstairs guest room. I beg your pardon, she had 19 wounds on her head, face, and one on her upper back. Obviously, these two were murdered. Was that house a crime scene? It was, of course, but only in a very general sense. The term crime scene investigations, as you might know, is CSI, first appeared in the Old English Dictionary in the year 2010. The idea of crime scene investigations, it's obviously a place where a serious crime has occurred, and what needs to happen as much as possible is to keep that place suspended, frozen in space and time. Objects in that space, the relation of objects to other objects in this space must be left undisturbed and uncontaminated. All of this, obviously, is to collect material evidence. It's become increasingly important with sophisticated analysis of what's sometimes called trace evidence, hair, fibers, anything potentially containing DNA. All of those developments are pretty recent and not from the 19th century really at all. That kind of evidence is much better than eyewitness testimony. Everybody still talks about eyewitnesses, but eyewitness testimony is increasingly understood to be pretty inaccurate most of the time. Now, as it turns out, much CSI protocol was set out, oh, I had another couple of pictures here, I forgot about that. That's also Abby Borden. You will notice that her shoes in that picture look sort of out of scale, and the reason for that is that it was her habit when she bustled around in the morning to slip on her husband's shoes. So she's wearing a pair of her husband Andrew's shoes there. Much CSI protocol was set out in a book published less than a year after these murders by this gentleman, Hans Gross, which, pretty apt name. His book was called Criminal Investigation, a Practical Handbook. It had 900 pages. That's a lot of handbook. Actually, it was not called that until it was translated from the German into English 13 years later in 1906. But that gets us beyond 1892. I picked 1892 because that's the date of the Borden case, which I have talked about, and the date seems pivotal because in looking at that case, I was struck by the number of criminal investigation developments that occurred either just before that date or fairly soon after that year. I will be referring to the Borden case. I'm not going to go into it in detail. That's a whole other talk because I assume you all have read something about it or you have at least seen one of the many movies about it, all of which are complete fiction. So anyway, that's where we are. You know that she was accused of having killed her father and her stepmother, not her mother. Okay. So what we're going to do is sort of in the framework of the Borden case, which I consider to be on the cusp of the sort of birth of some of the basics of murder investigation. We're going to look at fingerprints, crime scene photography, and blood-spatter analysis, which is really more properly called bloodstain pattern analysis. First, we have to acknowledge a system that was still used in 1892, but which would be largely discarded by about 1903. Solving crime is obviously all about identity. He did it. She did it. You need a system to identify suspects, mostly by trying to figure out who they are by comparing them to information that the police already has. That system back then was based mainly on eyewitnesses and luck, and some rudimentary document retrieval systems. The better system, of course, is building a catalog of criminal suspects, and the pioneer in that regard was a Parisian police officer named Alphonse Bertillon. Alphonse Bertillon. He is all over these early days of criminal investigation. He created a system called Anthropometry, or Bertillonage, this class of students. And this system uses 11 specific measurements of a person's body. This is the first chance for audience participation. The length, the width of the head, the length of the left foot, the length of the middle finger. This system is unwieldy, it's time consuming, it's flawed, but among the other parts of it were the meticulous notations and written descriptions of specific bodily marks. Obviously that's still something that can be used, something that's still helpful in identifying people, and photographs. By 1888, 4 years now before the Borden matter, Bertillon had invented the mugshot. And somebody took that one of him. And he developed something else, which we will get to shortly. Now, Bertillon is referred to in several works of fiction of the age, notably The Hound of the Baskervilles, in which Sherlock Holmes is described as the second highest expert in Europe. Now, let's move from anthropometry to the ID or investigation system that largely replaced it, dactyloscopy, fingerprint. In 1883, Mark Twain published a memoir called Life on the Mississippi, which contains many fictionalized accounts. But in chapter 31, which is entitled A Thumbprint and What Came of It, Twain has a character identify a murderer by obtaining a print of the lines on the ball of that gentleman's thumb. That's close enough to fingerprints to count as prophecy. But solving a murder by the use of fingerprints didn't happen until, in real life, until 9 years later. It was a double murder committed 6.5 weeks before the double Borden murders. On June 19th, 1892, a 6-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl were found bludgeoned to death in their bed in their home. And that was in Necochea, Argentina. It's a coastal town a few hundred miles southwest of Buenos Aires. Their mother was this lady. Her name is Francisca Roja. She was wounded in her throat. She immediately identified one of her neighbors, a man named Pedro Velasquez, as the killer. She told police she had rejected his sexual advances and he had grown increasingly aggressive in demanding that she marry him. Local police arrested Velasquez. They began some sophisticated investigation. They tortured him. He steadfastly maintained his innocence. They left him tied up all night to the bed that still contained the bodies of the murdered children. He continued to proclaim his innocence. And then the police began to doubt his guilt. But they tortured him for another week. He still proclaimed his innocence. Meanwhile, in July, this report of this double murder had reached the provincial capital in Argentina of La Plata. And a police inspector named Alvarez was sent from La Plata to Necochea. The police discovered Rojas' actual lover. And he said he wouldn't marry her because of her, quote, illegitimate brats. Alvarez, the officer who came down from La Plata, learned that Velasquez, the guy that she had named, had a very solid alibi. So suspicion began to grow around Rojas. So police tortured her too. They tied her up outside the front door of her house so the spirits of her murdered children could wreak their vengeance upon her. They even hired some men to make creepy noises to further terrify her. It didn't work. Now what? It's been a few weeks since these murders, and then somebody had an idea. I know, let's examine the murder scene. Alvarez goes in there and pretty quickly finds a bloody fingerprint on the door. Alvarez had been trained by Juan Vucetich. Juan was really Ivan. He was born in Croatia. He emigrated to Argentina when he was a teenager, and he joined the police. And in 1891, the year before the Rojas double murders, the year before the Borden double murders, he had launched in Buenos Aires the first fingerprint file system, based on a system developed by Charles Darwin's half-cousin, who we will get to. Alvarez cut out from the door the piece of it bearing the thumbprint, and then had Rojas supply her fingerprints. Seen here. And Alvarez asked her if she had touched the children, and she said she had not. And then he said something along the lines of, well, then how did this bloody thumbprint, which is yours, get on the door? And with that, she broke down, she confessed, she had murdered, crushed her children with a rock, so she could marry her young boyfriend. This is generally considered the first time that fingerprints solved a murder. It was in July 1892. Again, the Borden murders, to remind you, August 4th. Now, everybody knows no two people have the same fingerprints. If you don't believe me, just look at your fingerprints. Look at the fingerprints of the person sitting next to you. You'll see they're different. That was a joke. It has been known since at least the 18th century that fingerprints for each person are different than any other person. I mentioned Darwin's cusp, but before we get to him, William James Herschel, who was in India with his brother John, and Dr. Henry Falls. He was in Japan. These two were studying the systematic use of fingerprints since the 1850s, not necessarily to solve crimes, but for identification purposes. Herschel, go back to him again. Herschel, for instance, was using them on contracts for parties in the Indian Civil Service. Falls, also working on the fingerprint issue, tried to interest Charles Darwin, but he was 70 years old at that time, very, very advanced age. I'm kidding again. He was in poor health mainly, and he referred the issue to his cousin, a guy named Francis Galton. Francis Galton, who you see here, this is another one of Bertillon's mugshots. He was not a criminal, he was just about everything else, though. This guy, and by the way, tomorrow is his birthday. It was the bicentenary of his birth. He was born on February 16, 1822, which is something that you have to plan for and celebrate. But in this particular picture, he is 71 years old, which is even a better age. This guy did a lot of everything, not all of which has fared well in the judgment of history. He wrote more than 300 books and papers, and in some of those, he coined the term nature versus nurture, which you might have heard of. And he also coined the term eugenics. That's the practice you probably know of supposedly improving genetic traits of human populations. Frowned upon now, very much so. But widespread discussion of genetics in the late 19th, early 20th century. Only very recently, I want to say in 2020, he was connected with University College London, in London, and they have apologized for his role in eugenics, and recently they have changed the name of the theater there, which was apparently of his name, and they've changed the name of it to kind of elbow him aside a little bit, even though he gave him a ton of money, which he did. He also introduced the use of questionnaires and surveys to collect data. So he has a lot to answer for. But when he turned to studying fingerprints, he sort of unconsciously stoked a feud between Herschel and Falls. But more importantly, he ended up supplying the scientific basis of fingerprints. and most importantly, simplifying the system of comparing points in fingerprints. Simplification was the key. If you're comparing fingerprints, one from the scene, say, and one on a card, it's too complicated, it's not usable, worthless. So Galton boiled prints down into 8 broad categories, differentiating arches, loops, and whorls, and fingerprinting became the chief forensic method of establishing identity. By 1891, year before Rojas, year before Borden, Juan Vucetich using the system in Argentina. And in 1896, Argentina became the first country to officially adopt fingerprinting as a system of identification. Now, how might fingerprints have affected the investigation in Borden? Obviously, there were prints of Lizzie Borden and other household members all over the house. By the way, the house was sold, I don't know if you were looking to buy that place, but the house was sold last April. Again, so. Has been a bed and breakfast. Has anybody ever visited the Borden house? Has anybody ever spent the night at the Borden house? Has anybody spent the night in the bedroom of the victims? Has anybody spent the night in the bedroom of the victims as an anniversary present to his wife? Or husband. Anyways, by the way, that's what's usually known as the Borden house, is the house where the murders took place down on 2nd Street. There is another Lizzie Borden house in Fall River. It is the house that Lizzie and her sister Emma bought right after Lizzie was acquitted of murder in June of 1893. That house is up on, anybody here from Fall River? Swansea? Close enough. The Bordens had a farm in Swansea. And supposedly, one of the pillars from the fence in front of that farm is owned by a neighbor of mine around the corner, but he won't give it to me. Anyway, they bought a house that is Lizzie and Emma, a house called Maplecroft, which is on French Street in Fall River, which is up on the hill. That was the fashionable place to live then and probably now. That house is also for sale, price reduced as of last month, $800,000. Really spectacular house inside, really beautiful. So I'm told. Anyway, go back to the time of the crime. Fingerprints all over the place. The Borden family wouldn't be a surprise to find them on virtually anything in the house, but finding a stranger's print in the house, say on the door jamb between the dining room and the sitting room, which is right where Andrew's head was, that would have probably been of small use because there was no registry in Massachusetts to compare found prints to. Still, defense counsel for Lizzie Borden would have loved the police to find prints that did not match any known or knowable prints. The Bordens, their maid, Bridget Sullivan, their uncle, or Lizzie's uncle I should say, who showed up the night before the murders, J.B. Morse. So that would have been nice to find somebody's prints who was not one of the prints left by those people. And since no murder weapon was ever found, no prints there. That is the hatchet head that is on display in the Fall River Historical Society, which is on the hill in Fall River. It's not the murder weapon, in my opinion. Obviously, it would have been highly significant if the prints of Lizzie Borden or Bridget or anybody else had been found in blood, Rojas style. Now, the first murder print, fingerprint murder conviction in the United States was not until almost 20 years after the Borden case. 1910, which coincidentally is the year that Mark Twain died. An intruder broke into the West Chicago home of the Hiller family, which consisted of Mr. and Mrs. Hiller and their 4 daughters, as they slept. Kind of an amalgam that appeared in the newspapers at the time. Clarence Hiller confronted an intruder as he left one of the daughters' bedrooms. They struggled. They both fell down the stairs, which you might be able to pick out there in that picture. When they hit the bottom, the intruder shot Hiller twice. The intruder fled. Not far enough. The police soon picked him up, and the most important clue in the house to tie him to the murder of Clarence Hiller was the fact that the porch railing had been freshly painted. Whoops, imprint of a hand. Suspect had just been paroled from Joliet, Thomas Jennings. And at his trial, 4 fingerprint experts testified that the prints in the paint were a conclusive match to this gentleman. He appealed that to the Illinois Supreme Court, and largely on the basis of his argument, obviously his lawyer's arguments, against the reliability and therefore the admissibility into evidence of fingerprint evidence. It was that new that they said it's inherently unreliable. It's just not been established well enough. His conviction was affirmed. He was hanged in 1912. Now, you probably will have noticed that these fingerprint cases involve visible prints in blood and in paint. They are patent to the naked eye. In fact, prints left in paint or wax, soap, tar, those kinds of things are known as plastic fingerprints because they're 3-dimensional. What about latent prints? Latent prints are formed by the perspiration and the oils on a person's hand. These are not visible. In October 1902, in Paris, the murdered body of a dentist's servant was found. This is not all that graphic, but it is a dead guy. His name was Joseph Ribel. Photo taken by Alphonse Bertillon. A French scientist named Paul-Jean Coulier had developed a method of transferring latent fingerprints from the surface to paper through a process involving something called iodine fuming. Obviously, that medium has been replaced many times since. So Alphonse Bertillon, mugshots, crime scene photography. He's the guy who identified the prints left on a piece of fractured glass from a display cabinet as those of Henri Leon Shepard. His prints had been collected and placed in a file only months before. He was convicted of the murder of this gentleman. It looks like such a nice man, but apparently not that nice. Now, Alphonse Bertillon, mugshots, fingerprints, crime scene photography. He also set out to impose a system of methodical photographing and documenting of crime scenes. He began doing this, you just saw one of his photographs. He began doing this in Paris about 1890. He took ground level photographs like the one you just saw of Mr. Rebel, but he also eventually thought it would be more helpful to take overhead photographs, what were referred to as God's eye view photographs. And for that, he mounted a camera on a tripod about 6.5 feet or so above the subject, who quite often is lying on the floor or the ground. A couple of examples coming up. Dead bodies, not necessarily graphic and black and white in any event, but that's what they look like. These are attempts to obtain a clear picture of the scene around the body without distortion of perspective. But 2 years before Bertillon got going in 1890 in Paris with these crime scene photographs, the most famous murderer in history, sometimes inaccurately described as the first serial killer in history, was active in the East End of London. Many writers total Jack the Ripper's victims at 5. Others have a few more. It used to be said that these unfortunates had all been prostitutes, but a recent scholar disputes that, at least mostly. But they all were murdered, or at least found, outside, except one. She is usually considered the last of Jack the Ripper's victims. She was an Irish woman, about 25 years old. Her name was Mary Jane Kelly. The police took photos of her on November 9th, 1888, in her 12-foot by 12-foot room in Miller's Court, Dorset Street, Spitalfields, London. And these are generally considered the first photographs of a murder victim in place. Very graphic photo. This is the worst one. There's actually 2 photos. The second one is a little hard to even see what it is. But if you're at all squeamish and you don't want to see this one, this would be a good time to avert your glance. Mary Kelly. And that's the second photo of that scene. This is the most horrific Jack the Ripper murder because he had a lot of time in that room, apparently. And really eviscerated this woman. While today moving anything in a crime scene violates CSI methodology, one recent writer has argued that Mary Kelly's body had been repositioned. Not that it mattered because obviously Jack the Ripper, whoever that was, has never been identified except by about 600 people, each of whom has written a book about it and says that they have identified Jack the Ripper. Nobody has. Now, the same thing happened with the Bordens. That is, the crime scene photographs of bodies that were taken in place. You've seen 3 Borden victim photos, 2 of Abby, 1 of Andrew. These were not taken by the police. They were taken by a Fall River portrait photographer named James A. Walsh, who lived on Rodman Street, which is a few blocks from the Bordens, and he had a studio very nearby the Borden's house on South Main Street in Fall River. He, besides taking those photos that you've seen of the bodies, he also took photographs of the house, both inside and out. Now, Walsh had never taken crime scene photographs before. But he possibly, if not probably, had taken numerous post-mortem photographs. Another dead person. Photographing deceased relatives was common in the 19th century, the early 20th century, particularly photographs of infants and children. The mortality rate was relatively high. Many people during that era died at home. Such photographs, these post-mortem photographs, might be the only likeness that the family would ever have, especially of a deceased child. But this time around, the police went to Mr. Walsh and they decided that the potential magnitude of the Borden case demanded photographs be taken. I say magnitude because these people, the Bordens, were well known in Fall River. Andrew Borden, highly successful, making coffins, among other things. He had mostly retired by the time he was murdered. I think he retired in his early 50s. Multi-millionaire, millionaire many times over by present-day standards. No income tax, but still lived in that kind of small house that you first saw at the beginning. So anyway, he was well known, walking around town, that kind of thing. President of several boards in town, member of boards, all the banks, and there were a lot of banks then, that kind of stuff. So police think we better get somebody up here to photograph what's happened. And they sent for Walsh on the day of the murders, August 4th in the afternoon. And by then, though, both bodies had been moved, at least somewhat. Remember this one, Abby? Her body had been turned over at least once by a police officer named Doherty, then back at least once. The doctor who came over to look at her had pulled her arm out to feel her pulse. The bed was moved. There was a bed right next to her there. That was moved. Plus, as you see in this photograph, she's in a sheet. And she wasn't wearing that when she was running around the house picking up. Andrew, back to him. A little bit different photograph. One you don't see very often because you see that gentleman on the right, presumably a police officer, although not necessarily, who knows. The police turned Andrew's pockets out to determine whether there was a robbery. They found $81.65 in his pocket. Present day value, let's call it about $2,200. He had a watch of some value. He had a gold ring. His body had almost certainly been rearranged in a more decorous position on that bloodstain. Maybe he was pulled up. It is believed that certainly his arm was placed on that pillow there that you might not be able to see in the photograph. Lizzie did not testify at her trial, but she testified at 2 previous judicial hearings. And twice she testified that when her father got home that morning, he got home late in the morning of the day of his murder because he felt ill, so he came home. She testified twice that she had helped him remove his shoes and put on slippers on his feet. The photograph clearly shows what was known then as Congress boots. Those are boots with the elastic on the side. So obviously this photo contradicted Lizzie's testimony, and that was obviously held against her. She was probably, or at least possibly, correct on that point, though. It is believed that the police may have put his shoes back on because it was more dignified. Because his slippers were these big fuzzy things with rabbit ears on them. I'm kidding about that. But it's believed that the police did put shoes back on because of his standing in the town. Now, given the infancy of crime scene photography, given Mr. Walsh's inexperience, given his probable history of post-mortem photography, though, it's probable that the position of these corpses, especially Andrew, was altered. It's worth noting that the best-known photographs of slain soldiers in the Civil War, another corpse coming up, can't see it very well. Very famous photo from the battlefield at Gettysburg. This one was taken by either Alexander Gardner or Timothy O'Sullivan. It's called Home of a Rebel Sharpshooter. It's been demonstrated that this body, this man, had been moved some 40 yards to be put in this position, and the weapon that is shown there is a photographer's prop. This was apparently done for aesthetic or dramatic effect. Again, for Andrew, that obviously was not the motive. It was probably just to maintain some sense of dignity for the man. Now, assuming that Andrew and or Abby were moved, does that make any difference in the investigation of the case? It's kind of hard at this removed to think how, but you never know what might have been misconstrued. So, the Borden case, no fingerprint evidence, 3 victim crime scene photographs, but there was blood spatter evidence, bloodstain pattern analysis. Several doctors testified about it at Lizzie Borden's trial in June of 1893, with probably small effect. One possible important exception. The question whether the assailant of the Bordens, whoever that was, whether it was Lizzie or somebody else, especially in regard to Andrew, would likely have been struck by spattering blood. Now, bloodstain pattern analysis as a forensic tool was in its infancy at best in 1892, 1890s generally. The pioneering study about bloodstains, which is very catchily entitled On the Formation, Form, Direction, and Spreading of Bloodstains Following Blunt Trauma to the Head, that's the title, by a gentleman named Eduard Piotrowski from the University of Krakow, was published by the University of Vienna in 1895, 3 years after the Borden murders. But that gentleman's experiments, in order to reach the conclusions that he did, were considered suspect. All I'll say about his methodology is rabbits. So the discipline of blood spatter technology analysis foundered for years. And then a classic book called Homicide Investigation by Lemoyne Snyder appeared in 1941. And even that very influential volume contained only what would now be considered elementary or baseline information about bloodstains. Another 30 years went by. 1971 appeared the first modern treatise analyzing bloodstains. Herbert Leon McDonald's Flight Characteristics and Stain Patterns of Human Blood, 1971, published by the Department of Justice. You want me to go back over these titles so you can go look them up? Now, between those two texts, the 1941 and 1971, occurred the infamous July 4th, 1954 murder case, Dr. Sam Shepard, accused of killing his wife Marilyn in their suburban Cleveland home. That was the inspiration for the television show and movie The Fugitive. Very influential case with this blood spatter issue. A lot of evidence in the trial about blood analysis in the house, on clothing, that kind of thing. And just to round off and sort of emphasize, underline how new this discipline is, the International Association of Bloodstain Pattern Analysts, I don't know if anybody's, no, that was formed only in 1983. Now that I say that, though, you know, I think of things in the 80s and the 90s as being recent. It isn't anymore, which is kind of sad and maybe a topic for another talk. Now, one thing, though, blood stain pattern analysis can reveal is the relative positions of persons and objects at a scene. Not much of an issue in Borden. There was some evidence about that, as I mentioned. One of the Commonwealth's chief experts was a gentleman at Harvard named Dr. Edward Wood. This is not the Ed Wood who made the movie Plan 9 from Outer Space. It's a different Ed Wood. But he, in the trial, goes in there and he denigrated this whole idea of, quote, rules governing blood spillage. or blood spatter. And his quote was, "It might spatter in any direction and might not spatter in every direction." I'm not sure what that was. Others enumerated blood areas and spots, but in the words of the first doctor on the scene on the morning of August 4th, 1892, there was nothing by way of blood to indicate the slaughter that had taken place. Most important, although there's no way to know how much, there is general agreement that some blood was spattered on the killer. So in that house, you might recall, Abby upstairs on the floor, she was murdered shortly after 9 o'clock in the morning, while Andrew was murdered nearly 2 hours later, minutes either side of 11 in the morning. Remember, he was out of the house. He apparently went out of the house with Uncle Morris minutes before Abby was murdered. Now, overarching the whole Borden case was the general public's reluctance, in some ways, to believe that a woman could kill somebody with a hatchet. From the 19th century, even earlier, and then into the 20th century, it was generally believed that if a woman wants to kill somebody, she's going to poison them, not hack them up. So that was kind of hanging over the case. But there are two evidential mysteries and issues of reasonable doubt for the jury. By the way, the jury, all white guys. First time a woman sat on a jury in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, what do you think? Guesses of the year. Close, 1951. And that was as a result of a statute passed the previous year by the legislature, 1951. So, big mystery, where is the murder weapon, or was the murder weapon, and why was there no blood on Lizzie Borden? The corollary to that last point, why was there no blood anywhere in the house except on or just around the victims? Lizzie Borden, we know, went at least to the kitchen, and if there were an intruder, why were there no blood traces, blood drops to any exit? Now, you might remember the Elizabeth Montgomery movie. If Lizzie had murdered Abby, whatever blood transfer she picked up could have been cleaned off in an hour and a half, because as we know, nobody saw Lizzie in that interval between about 9 and about 11. Bridget was in the house. By the way, her name was Bridget Sullivan. Lizzie and her sister called her Maggie because that was the name of the previous maid. Didn't bother to learn a woman's name, which was Bridget. She, though, generally gets a pass. She had a little room up on what would really be the third floor. It's kind of almost like an attic. It's a small floor. She was supposedly napping during this whole time because she didn't feel it. So nobody saw Lizzie Borden until she, quote, finds Andrew. And then there are immediately people in the house, starting with the next door neighbor, a woman named Adelaide Churchill. They're there within minutes. Luminol could have helped. Luminol is a chemical that glows blue in a darkened area. The problem with luminol is it does react to the iron in hemoglobin, but it also reacts to bleach, fecal matter, that kind of thing. But its properties were not found until 1928 and not developed until 1937. So the fact that no one, including a growing number of police officers, saw any blood on Lizzie Borden has convinced many people, probably influenced the jury, that she did not commit the murders. She has, though, been on trial since August 4th, 1892. People still write about Abby Borden, Lizzie Borden, write about Abby Borden too. But books are coming out still all the time about Lizzie Borden, some purporting to be factual, some novels, movies, all the rest of it. Her case occurred just before the investigative techniques that were developed that might have solidly supported her acquittal or convicted her. And with that, that's the end. I almost never do this, but this is an ad for this Sunday. This is an online talk through the Historical Society of Old Yarmouth and the Cultural Center of Cape Cod that I'll be giving on Sunday afternoon online. Anybody have any questions? Compliments? Oh, question. Yeah, go ahead.
Compliment, thank you. The fingerprints, do they ever change, like, as we get older, are they,
No.
so you don't ever lose them?
Actually, you do, but they do deteriorate in pretty old age. They do deteriorate. There are some people who were born without fingerprints too.
'Cause
And
I
all of them
can't
are criminals,
fingerprint
every
me.
single one of them.
They
No.
can't fingerprint me anymore.
I'm sorry, they can't fingerprint you?
No, but maybe the police could, but, you know,
Have you, did you use acid like Dillinger? What did you do?
I was a nurse.
Oh,
I was watching.
oh, yeah, that could be, yeah, chemicals,
Yeah.
that kind of thing, yeah.
I was a nurse.
That might have, dried up some of the oils in your fingers, that kind of thing, yeah. Anybody, else have a question that I can guess an answer to? Thanks very much, I appreciate it. Oh, yes, I'm sorry, another question.
How far back can they go now if they have like blood or some kind of evidence on a piece of clothing from a while ago?
Are you talking about the Shroud of Turin?
Not that far back, but basically before things aren't reliable. Do you know that?
It all depends. The blood they can get some DNA out of blood quite far back. I mean, I don't know that I could give you a date, but a lot of it depends on the conditions that the blood has been in, because all that stuff obviously deteriorates and degrades. But they can go back pretty far to get DNA out of blood. Pretty far is a pretty vague answer, but that's my answer. Anybody else? Thanks again, I appreciate it.